In last Epoch, there's a stat called ward retention that you'll sometimes see on gear and passives. Most notably, you get 4% ward retention per 1 intelligence, which I imagine is where the majority of people's ward retention comes from. Ward retention lowers the rate at which your ward decays over time. If you have a baseline understanding of how ward works, it's not hard to see why such a stat might be useful. However, it's not immediately clear how to judge the opportunity cost of ward retention modifiers. Luckily, we have an equation for that. This is how ward decay rate depends on current ward, ward decay threshold, and ward retention. For those of you who aren't interested in the math, here's a summary. Just think of 2% ward retention as 1% increased ward. That's it. That's the video. Thanks for watching. If you want the details, let's keep going. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to neglect ward decay threshold by assuming it's 0. This will simplify the discussion of ward retention. It's easy to account for ward decay threshold after the fact, but I want to keep this discussion focused on ward retention. When you gain ward, you get some extra shield over your health bar that decays exponentially over time. With 0 modifiers to ward, your ward decay rate is 40% of current ward per second. This means that in order to sustain a given amount of ward, you need to be able to generate 40% of your current ward value every second to counteract the decay. Ward retention decreases that ward decay rate, but its implementation is a bit unintuitive. When you have ward retention, your ward decay rate gets divided by 1 plus half your ward retention stat. Because of this strange factor of 0.5, you actually need 200% ward retention to cut your ward decay rate in half to 20% of current ward per second. In other words, 200% ward retention makes your ward last 100% longer. 400% ward retention makes ward last 200% longer. 600% is 300% longer, etc. I'm not sure why the devs decided to put a 0.5 in the formula here, instead of simply dividing all ward retention values in the game by 2. That would have changed nothing other than to make ward retention values more intuitive to understand. For example, 100% ward retention would have meant that ward lasts 100% longer. That seems more logical to me, but maybe I'm missing something. Even if you're now on board with how ward retention affects ward decay rate, there's still a degree of separation between that and what we're ultimately interested in. How exactly does ward retention impact the total amount of ward you can sustain? Well, think of it like this. If you're able to generate 100 ward per second, then without any ward retention, you'll reach a steady state at about 250 ward. At that point, your decay rate is 100 ward per second, and since you can only gain 100 ward per second, this is the amount you're able to sustain. If instead you have 200% ward retention, then you'll even out at 500 ward. That's because you now lose 20% of your ward per second instead of 40%. So you need to get to 500 ward before your ward decay rate equals your ward gain rate of 100 per second. Without loss of generality, we can say that 200% ward retention doubles the maximum amount of ward that one can retain. Following this same pattern, 400% ward retention will triple ward sustain, 600% ward retention will quadruple it, etc. In other words, you can kind of think of every 2% ward retention as 1% increased ward. If you're more of an equation person, here's the ward formula solved for current ward. We can see that the factor 1 plus 0.5 ward retention appears as a simple multiplier to current ward. This confirms that at 600% ward retention, you can retain 300% more ward. At this level of ward retention, which is reasonable for an endgame character with a lot of intelligence, every 1 additional ward gained per second is an additional 10 total ward. It's evident at this point how that factor of 0.5 in the formula obfuscates things. Why does 600% ward retention equal 300% more ward? Wouldn't it make more sense if 300% ward retention equaled 300% more ward? I digress. That's it for this one. There's a lot more that can be said about ward with all the different methods of generating it, the various items that enable ward builds, and the current state of balance between ward builds and health builds. I'd rather stick to basic mechanics for now. As always, please leave your feedback and questions in the comments. Thanks for watching.